You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. If you're listening to this recording, then I'm already dead. Not dead in the way you understand death, but dead to the world I used to know. My name was Caspian Thorne, and 17 hours ago, I was a living, breathing human being with a social security number, a driver's license, and a bank account in St. Louis. Now I'm something else entirely, speaking to you from inside a porcelain doll that sits in Section K of the Thornwick Porcelain Works Grand Archive. I don't know how long this recording will last before they discover it. The other spirits here are trying to stop me from telling you this story. They whisper that breaking the silence will only bring more victims, more souls to join our eternal collection. But someone needs to know the truth about what happens when you take the night janitor job at Thornwick Porcelain Works in rural Missouri. I'm speaking to you from inside the body of a 1952 collectible doll named Little Timothy that bears my childhood face. My consciousness has been compressed into 8 inches of porcelain and fabric, and I can feel the other trapped souls pressing against the walls of this tiny prison. If you listen carefully, you might hear them too. 47 previous night janitors, all speaking at once, all trying to warn you about the rules. But let me start at the beginning, because the real horror isn't in how I died. It's in how I lived for 5 weeks, thinking I was just cleaning a factory when I was actually participating in the most sophisticated supernatural harvesting operation ever created. Every decision I made, every choice I thought was my own, was carefully orchestrated by forces that have been perfecting their methods for over a century and a half. The story really begins 6 months ago, not 3, when I first started having the dreams. Dreams about carousel music and children's laughter, about porcelain faces that watched me sleep, about a voice calling my name from somewhere far away. I thought they were stress dreams from my divorce, manifestations of anxiety about Jennifer taking half my life and all my self-respect. But now I understand those dreams were transmissions, psychic advertisements broadcast by the factory's consciousness, harvesting systems to identify suitable candidates. The dreams were evaluation tools, testing my susceptibility to supernatural influence and my psychological profile for compatibility with the collection process. 3 months ago, I was Caspian Thorne, age 28, recently divorced auto mechanic from St. Louis with calloused hands and a drinking problem I was trying to forget. My ex-wife Jennifer had taken everything I cared about. Our house, our dog, even my collection of vintage motorcycle parts, leaving me with a beat-up Ford pickup and a burning desire to disappear somewhere she'd never think to look for me. The divorce hadn't just been expensive, it had been deliberately destructive. Jennifer's lawyer had used tactics that seemed designed to isolate me from friends and family, to create the exact kind of desperation and social disconnection that made someone an ideal candidate for Thornwick's recruitment process. Looking back now, I realized that even my divorce had been influenced by the factory's long-range psychological manipulation systems. I chose Ravenscroft, Missouri because it was the kind of place that didn't exist on GPS until you were already there. Population 847, surrounded by rolling hills and cornfields that stretched beyond the horizon. The kind of town where the local diner served coffee in cups that hadn't been washed properly since 1987, and the hardware store owner knew your life story before you'd finished introducing yourself. But Ravenscroft wasn't a random choice, even though I thought it was at the time. The dreams had been guiding me toward rural Missouri for months, creating subconscious associations between open farmland and emotional peace, between small towns and fresh starts. The factory's influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries, using techniques that modern psychology was only beginning to understand. I rented a small apartment above Hendrick's hardware store on Main Street, and that's where the real manipulation began. Mrs. Hendrick was friendly in the way that small-town people are supposed to be, always ready with local gossip and recommendations for employment opportunities. She mentioned Thornwick Porcelain Works on my second day in town, describing it as the largest employer in the county and a real opportunity for someone with mechanical skills. Looking back, I can see how every conversation with Mrs. Hendrick was designed to plant specific ideas and create particular emotional responses. She mentioned that the factory paid well, that they were very particular about their employees, and that not everyone is suited for the work they do there. Her casual comments created exactly the right combination of financial incentive and personal challenge that made the job irresistible when I finally saw the posting. I found the job posting on a Tuesday that felt like the end of the world. Taped to the window of Molly's diner, written on cream-coloured paper that felt expensive between my fingers. Night janitor position available. Thornwick Porcelain Works. Competitive wages, minimal supervision, immediate start. Serious inquiries only. Contact Cordelia Ashworth. The salary listed was more than I'd made as a head mechanic, which should have been my first warning. Nobody pays premium wages for pushing a mop unless there's something seriously wrong with the job. But I was desperate, and desperation makes you ignore red flags that should be visible from space. What I didn't know was that the job posting only appeared when the factory's psychological evaluation systems had identified a suitable candidate. The paper wasn't just expensive, it was treated with chemical compounds that enhanced psychological receptivity, making anyone who handled it more susceptible to suggestion and less likely to question obvious inconsistencies. Thornwick Porcelain Works sat 23 miles outside Ravenscroft, accessible only by a gravel road that wound through forest, so thick it blocked out the afternoon sun. The drive itself was part of the recruitment process, designed to create isolation and dependency while gradually exposing candidates to the supernatural fields that surrounded the factory complex. When I finally emerged into the clearing where the factory stood, I felt like I'd driven into a Gothic novel. The complex was massive. 4 red brick buildings connected by covered walkways surrounded by wrought iron fencing that looked like it belonged around a Victorian cemetery. Every window was filled with diamond pane glass that caught sunlight and threw it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The architecture belonged to another century, all pointed arches and elaborate stonework that must have cost a fortune to maintain. But more unsettling was the way the buildings seemed to watch me as I approached. Windows reflected light in ways that suggested eyes, and shadows moved independently of their sources, creating the impression that the factory itself was a living entity, observing my arrival. A bronze plaque near the main entrance read, "Established 1849, Thornwick Family Porcelain Works, 5 generations of fine collectible dolls." But it was the dolls visible through the windows that made my skin crawl. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in displays that looked more like shrines than product showcases. Even from outside, I could see their glass eyes tracking my movement across the parking lot, and I swear I heard faint whispers carried on the wind. Miss Cordelia Ashworth met me in the reception area, and I knew immediately that she was exactly the kind of person who could make bodies disappear without losing sleep. Mid-60s, silver hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her facial skin, wearing a charcoal wool suit that probably cost more than my truck. But it was her eyes that made me want to run. Pale grey and completely empty, like looking into the windows of an abandoned house. "Mr. Thorne," she said, extending a hand that felt like shaking hands with a corpse. "Thank you for coming. I've been the evening operations supervisor here for 28 years. Her voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple people speaking at once, and when she smiled, I could see that her teeth were too perfect to be natural. They looked like porcelain replicas, each one individually crafted and fitted with unsettling precision. "I've been expecting you," she continued, which struck me as odd since I hadn't called ahead to schedule the interview. "We've been monitoring your progress since you arrived in Ravenscroft." Her office was a museum of wealth and death. Dark wood panelling covered the walls, interrupted by oil paintings of stern-faced men in Victorian clothing and framed photographs of dolls that looked far too realistic to be comfortable. Her desk was clear except for a leather appointment book and what looked like a human skull being used as a paperweight. But it was the photographs that really unnerved me. Each one showed a doll with a face that looked disturbingly familiar, as if I'd seen these people somewhere before, but couldn't quite place them. Their expressions held intelligence and awareness that porcelain shouldn't be able to convey, and their eyes seemed to track my movement, even in static images. "The Thornwick family has owned this facility for 5 generations, she explained, her voice carrying the flat affect of someone reading from a script they'd memorized decades ago. "We maintain the highest standards of traditional craftsmanship. Our dolls are highly sought after by very specific collectors." The way she said specific collectors made me think of basement dwellings and police surveillance, but I needed the job too badly to ask questions. She opened a manila folder that contained what appeared to be a complete psychological profile of my life. Employment history, financial records, medical information, and even photographs of me that I didn't remember posing for. "You have exactly the qualifications we're looking for," she said, reviewing the documents with obvious satisfaction. "Mechanical aptitude, attention to detail, and most importantly, the psychological resilience necessary for our particular working environment." "What exactly does that mean?" I asked. "Thornwick Porcelain Works operates on multiple levels of reality, Mr. Thorne. Our night shift employees encounter phenomena that might disturb individuals with less flexible worldviews. Your psychological profile suggests you'll adapt well to our unique operational requirements." The factory tour began in the moulding foundry, a cathedral-like space with vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that cast everything in blood-red light. Industrial equipment lined the walls, casting machines, potter's wheels, and workstations covered in tools I didn't recognize. But dominating the center of the room was an enormous antique firing chamber that looked like it belonged in a crematorium.
"Our original kiln from 1849, Miss Ashworth said with obvious pride. "It's been in continuous operation for over a century and a half. The firing techniques we use, well, let's just say they produce very special results."
The chamber was easily 12 feet tall and 8 feet wide, its blackened metal surface covered in symbols that weren't quite letters and weren't quite pictures. Heat radiated from it despite the fact that no fire was visible, and I could swear I heard something moving around inside. The symbols seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, creating patterns that hurt my eyes and made my head throb. "Is it in use right now?" I asked. Miss Ashworth's smile never reached her eyes. "The kiln operates on its own schedule, Mr. Thorne. We've learned not to interfere with its processes. The firing chamber is where our most valuable pieces are created, using techniques that modern technology cannot replicate." As she spoke, I noticed that the temperature in the room was rising, and the symbols on the kiln were beginning to glow with their own internal light. The air tasted metallic, like blood mixed with ozone, and I could hear what sounded like distant screaming coming from inside the sealed chamber. The artisan's wing contained dozens of workstations where craftspeople applied finishing touches to completed dolls. Magnifying lamps, brushes, and paint palettes covered every surface, but it was the dolls themselves that made my stomach turn. They weren't just realistic, They were hyper-realistic, with facial expressions that suggested consciousness and eyes that definitely tracked movement. Our artisans used traditional techniques, Miss Ashworth explained as we walked past a workstation where a half-finished doll lay with one eye installed. Each piece requires months of individual attention. We spare no expense in achieving authenticity. The working dolls were in various stages of completion, but even the unfinished pieces seemed aware of our presence. Heads without bodies turned to follow our movement, eyes without faces blinked when they thought we weren't looking, and I swear I heard one of them whisper my name as we passed. At one workstation, an artisan was applying makeup to a doll's face with brushes so fine they looked like individual hairs. But the makeup wasn't paint. It was some kind of organic substance that pulsed and moved on its own, adapting to the doll's expressions and creating lifelike skin tones that shifted with the lighting. "What is that material?" I asked. "Trade secret," Miss Ashworth replied. "We've developed proprietary techniques for creating artificial skin that responds to environmental stimuli. It's one of the reasons our dolls are so highly valued by collectors." The quality control pavilion housed inspection areas and packaging stations, but also something that looked disturbingly like an operating room. Bright lights, metal tables, and instruments that belonged in a hospital rather than a doll factory. Steam rose from drains in the floor, and the air smelled of disinfectant mixed with something organic and unpleasant. "Sometimes minor adjustments are required," Miss Ashworth said when she noticed my stare. "Quality control is paramount in our business. Every piece must meet exact specifications before it can join the collection." On one of the metal tables, a doll lay partially disassembled, while technicians in surgical masks worked on its internal mechanisms. But the mechanisms looked more like organs than clockwork. Pulsing red tubes that might have been blood vessels, grey matter that resembled brain tissue, and a rhythmic beating that suggested a heart. "That's very sophisticated engineering," I managed to say. "Indeed, our dolls are far more complex than they appear. Creating artificial life requires attention to details that most manufacturers overlook." But it was the Grand Archive that revealed the true scope of what I was dealing with. The warehouse space seemed to stretch forever, filled with towering shelves that held thousands upon thousands of completed dolls. Not just dolls, but an army of miniature humans, arranged in perfect formation. Each section was labelled with brass plaques indicating different eras and styles, but they all shared the same unsettling realism. Victorian dolls in elaborate gowns stood next to modern pieces in contemporary clothing, all of them watching me with glass eyes that reflected light like real pupils. "We maintain the world's largest collection of artisanal dolls," Miss Ashworth said as we walked through aisles that seemed to go on forever. "Some pieces are worth more than luxury automobiles. Others are priceless." The dolls weren't just displayed randomly. They were organised in formations that suggested military units or religious congregations. Groups of similar-looking dolls stood together as if they were families, while others were arranged in circles as if they were conducting meetings or ceremonies. Near the back of the archive, she gestured towards a section marked with brass plaques, reading Section K, Historical Collection, 1849 to 1955 inches. "Our oldest and most valuable inventory," she said, and for the first time, her voice carried genuine emotion. "These dolls represent the work of the first 4 generations of Thornwick craftsmen. They're unique in ways that modern techniques simply cannot replicate." Even from a distance, I could see that the dolls in Section K were different. They didn't just look realistic. They looked alive, as if they were holding their breath and waiting for us to leave, so they could resume whatever conversations we'd interrupted. Their clothing was museum quality, their expressions were perfectly human, and their eyes held intelligence that made my skin crawl. Each piece in Section K contains elements that cannot be reproduced, Miss Ashworth continued. They represent the pinnacle of our craft, created using techniques that died with their makers. As we walked closer to Section K, I could hear something that made me stop in my tracks. Whispering. Dozens of tiny voices having conversations in languages I didn't recognize, punctuated by occasional words in English that made my blood run cold. New employee. Another candidate. He'll join us soon. The process is beginning. Miss Ashworth pretended not to hear the voices, but I saw her smile slightly as she noticed my reaction. The acoustics in this section are quite unique, she said. Old buildings often have unusual sound properties. As we concluded the tour, Miss Ashworth led me back to her office and handed me a typed document on the same expensive paper as the job posting. The moment I touched it, I felt a strange tingling sensation as if the paper was somehow alive. These are our operational protocols for night maintenance, she said, her tone shifting to something that sounded almost ceremonial. They have been developed and refined through decades of experience. Previous employees who disregarded these guidelines either left our employment very suddenly or experienced workplace incidents that required permanent medical attention. The list contained 10 specific rules, but as I read them, I realized they weren't workplace policies. They were survival instructions. Never enter the moulding foundry before midnight or after 5 a.m. If you hear carousel music playing, immediately retreat to the supervisor's office and remain until silence returns. The dolls in Section K of the Grand Archive must always face inward towards the center aisle. If any have shifted position, correct them and evacuate the section immediately. Avoid direct eye contact with any doll whose gaze appears to follow your movements. If you discover a doll outside its designated area, transport it to Section K without examining its facial features. The ancient firing chamber in the foundry must stay sealed. Never attempt to open it regardless of any sounds emanating from within. Complete your cleaning in sequential zones. Never abandon supplies or equipment unattended. When overhead lights pulse in groups of 3, cease all activity and remain motionless for 45 seconds. The service lift to the lower vault is condemned. Under absolutely no circumstances should you attempt operation. Exit exclusively through the main reception doors. Emergency exits are forbidden during night operations. These rules seem very specific, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mr. Thorne, Miss Ashworth replied, leaning forward across her desk. Thornwick Porcelain Works is not an ordinary manufacturing facility. We deal with materials and processes that require extraordinary precautions. The rules exist to protect you from forces that you cannot possibly understand. Follow them exactly, and you will have a safe and profitable employment experience. Ignore them. She gestured towards a framed photograph on her desk showing a young man in a janitor's uniform who looked terrified. His eyes held the same desperate intelligence I'd seen in the dolls, and his mouth was open as if he was screaming silently for help. Well, let's just say that Mr. Patterson from last month wished he had been more careful. I wanted to ask what had happened to Patterson, but something in Miss Ashworth's expression suggested that curiosity about former employees was strongly discouraged. Instead, I found myself staring at the photograph, noticing details that shouldn't have been possible in a still image. The man's eyes seemed to track my movement, and his expression changed subtly, as if he was trying to communicate something important. You'll work Sunday through Thursday, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., she continued. Your first shift begins tomorrow evening. I'll meet you here at 9:30 to provide your keys and complete the final paperwork. The salary she quoted was exactly double what any janitor should make, which sealed the deal despite every instinct screaming at me to run. I needed the money, and I told myself that wealthy, eccentric employers often had unusual workplace policies that seemed crazy to outsiders. But as I signed the employment contract, I noticed that the legal language was far more complex than it should have been for a simple janitorial position. Clauses about intellectual property transfer, consciousness licensing agreements, and permanent employment obligations filled pages of dense text that would have required a lawyer to fully understand. "Don't worry about the legal details," Miss Ashworth said when she saw me hesitating. "Standard corporate boilerplate. Our legal department tends to overcomplicate simple employment agreements." I signed without reading further, which was exactly what she was counting on. I spent the next day in my apartment above Hendrick's hardware store, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just signed up for something that would end very badly. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dolls in Section K, their glass eyes following my movement with unmistakable intelligence. Mrs. Hendrick brought me dinner that evening. Homemade pot roast with vegetables that tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months. But as I ate, I noticed that the food had an unusual aftertaste, slightly metallic with hints of something I couldn't identify. I felt drowsy after the meal, but also strangely euphoric, as if my anxiety about the new job had been chemically suppressed. "First day nerves," Mrs. Hendrick said when I mentioned feeling odd. "Perfectly natural. You'll do fine at Thornwick. They're very good to their employees." The way she emphasized very good made me think she knew more about the factory than she was letting on, but the chemical euphoria made it difficult to pursue uncomfortable questions. That night, I drove back to Thornwick Porcelain Works through forest that seemed darker and thicker than it had the day before. The trees pressed closer to the road, their branches forming a canopy so dense that my headlights barely penetrated the gloom. By the time I reached the factory clearing, a full moon had risen overhead, casting the Gothic buildings in silver light that made them look like something from a horror movie. But under the moonlight, I could see details that had been hidden during my afternoon tour. The wrought iron fencing wasn't just decorative, it was covered in symbols similar to those on the firing chamber, and it pulsed with its own faint luminescence. The windows of the buildings glowed from within, not with electric light, but with something organic and unsettling. Miss Ashworth was waiting in the reception area with my keys, security codes, and a detailed facility map that showed areas I was authorized to access and others that were strictly forbidden. The forbidden zones were marked in red ink and included the entire basement level, several rooms in each building, and something called the Collection Preparation Laboratory. "Remember, Mr. Thorne," she said as she prepared to leave, "the rules exist for your protection. Follow them exactly, and you'll find this to be very rewarding employment. Deviate from them." She didn't finish the sentence, just gathered her coat and briefcase and walked into the night. But I noticed that she didn't drive away. Through the reception windows, I could see her car parked in the shadows at the edge of the clearing, and I had the distinct impression that she would be watching my performance during my first shift. The moment her car disappeared from view, I felt the factory change around me. During the day tour, it had been an impressive but ultimately normal manufacturing facility. Now it felt like a living entity that was slowly waking up and taking notice of my presence. The air itself seemed different, thicker, more oppressive, charged with electricity that made my hair stand on end. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath formed visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. But most unsettling was the sound, a low-frequency humming that seemed to come from the building structure itself, punctuated by occasional clicks and whispers that suggested hidden activity. I started with the quality control pavilion, working my way through inspection areas and packaging stations while trying to ignore the dolls that watched my every movement. The night lighting was dimmer than I'd expected, casting everything in shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. It was while cleaning near the operating room setup that I found the first evidence that Thornwick Porcelain Works wasn't just a doll factory. Hidden beneath a tarp in the corner was a collection of medical equipment that belonged in a hospital, not a toy manufacturing facility. Anesthesia machines, surgical instruments, monitoring devices, and what looked like a complex life support system with tubes and wires that connected to a central processing unit. I photographed everything with my phone, though the images came out strangely distorted, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on what it was seeing. The medical equipment appeared to be recently used. Stainless steel surfaces showed signs of recent cleaning, and indicator lights suggested that some of the machines were currently operational. On a nearby desk, I found medical journals open to articles about consciousness transfer, brain-computer interfaces, and something called neural pattern preservation in artificial substrates. The articles were heavily annotated in handwriting that looked decades old, with notes in the margins that discuss success rates, optimization techniques, and patient preparation protocols. Around 11:45 p.m, I moved to the artisans wing to begin cleaning the craftwork areas. The workstations were cluttered with the tools of professional doll making, but also with items that made no sense in that context. Medical journals, anatomy textbooks, and what looked like psychiatric evaluation forms covered several desks. It was while organising papers at one of the workstations that I found a folder labelled Subject Integration Protocols, containing documents that made my blood run cold. Technical specifications for something called consciousness transfer procedures, success rates for personality preservation during physical transition, and detailed psychological profiles of people who looked disturbingly familiar. One profile belonged to someone named Michael Patterson, the same last name as the janitor Miss Ashworth had mentioned. His photograph showed a young man who looked exactly like one of the dolls I'd seen in Section K. The profile included his employment history, psychological evaluation results, and a detailed timeline of his integration process that ended with a notation transfer complete. Subject 47 successfully integrated into collection K1, 1847. Another profile belonged to Lisa Morrison, described as a night security guard, 2019 to 2020 inches. Her psychological evaluation noted high empathy levels, strong protective instincts, susceptible to guilt-based manipulation. The timeline of her integration process showed a gradual escalation of supernatural encounters designed to trigger specific emotional responses, culminating in a voluntary rule violation that justified immediate transfer to permanent collection status. A third profile documented someone named Jennifer Taylor, whose occupation was listed as cleaning staff 2021. Her evaluation results noted financially desperate, recently divorced, limited social connections, ideal candidate for isolation-based recruitment. The timeline showed how her financial desperation had been artificially enhanced through targeted economic pressure before she was recruited for the night cleaning position. As I read through the profiles, I realised that every person documented in the folder had been specifically selected and psychologically manipulated to become suitable candidates for whatever the integration process involved. Their profiles read like hunting strategies, detailing exactly how to exploit each individual's weaknesses and psychological vulnerabilities. That's when I heard the carousel music for the first time. The melody drifted from the direction of the moulding foundry, faint but unmistakable. The Blue Danube played at the slow, hypnotic tempo of a children's ride, but underneath the familiar tune, I could hear something that raised every hair on my body. Children's voices singing along in a language I didn't recognize, and woven through it all, my name being called in sing-song harmony. Caspian, Caspian, come and play with us, Caspian. But it wasn't just children's voices. Adult voices joined the chorus, people I recognized from the psychological profiles I'd been reading. Michael Patterson's voice, Lisa Morrison's voice, Jennifer Taylor's voice, all singing my name in harmonies that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to primitive parts of my brain. Following the rules exactly, I dropped everything and ran to the supervisor's office, locking the door behind me. Through the frosted glass, I could see small shadows moving in the hallway, child-sized figures dancing and playing while the music continued. There were also adult-sized shadows, figures in work uniforms that looked exactly like the one I was wearing. The music lasted for 27 minutes before gradually fading away, but the shadows remained visible for another 10 minutes after silence returned. During those final minutes, the shadows pressed against the glass door, and I could hear whispered conversations about the new employee and beginning the process, and he'll understand soon enough. When I finally emerged from the office, I found that every doll in the artisan's wing had been repositioned to face the supervisor's office door. But more unsettling was the discovery that someone had been through my cleaning supplies while I was hiding. My equipment had been rearranged. My schedule had been modified to include areas that weren't on my original work list, and a new set of keys had been added to my ring. Keys that opened doors marked as forbidden zones. Tuesday night brought my first direct encounter with the consciousness trapped in Section K. While cleaning the Grand Archive, I discovered that 15 dolls in the historical section had turned to face outward instead of inward, towards the center aisle. But as I approached to correct their positions, one of them spoke. "You're the new night cleaner," said a doll with the face of a middle-aged man and the voice of someone who had been screaming for a very long time. "I used to have your job. My name was Robert Chen, and I've been trapped in this body for 6 years." I stared at the doll in horror as other nearby figures began to speak. "I'm Lisa Morrison, night security guard from 2019. Thomas Williams, maintenance worker, 2017. Jennifer Taylor, cleaning lady, 2021. Michael Patterson, janitor, lasted 3 weeks before they got me." "We all broke the rules," the first doll continued. "We all thought we were smarter than the system. Now we're part of the collection, and we'll never leave." The dolls' mouths didn't move when they spoke, but their glass eyes tracked my movement with perfect coordination. I could see intelligence behind those eyes. Genuine human consciousness, trapped in porcelain prisons. Their expressions held the desperate hope of people who had been screaming for help for years without anyone hearing them. "Run," whispered a doll, with a child's face but an adult woman's voice. "Run while you still can. Don't end up like us." But even as they warned me, I could see other dolls throughout Section K beginning to turn and face my direction. Hundreds of trapped souls, all trying to communicate, all desperate for someone to acknowledge their existence. "The rules aren't protection, they're part of the process," said another voice. "Miss Ashworth isn't human anymore," added a third. "The factory doesn't make dolls, it makes vessels," explained a fourth. "You're not cleaning the building, you're maintaining a prison," said a fifth. "The carousel music is calling more victims," warned a sixth. "The firing chamber isn't for porcelain, it's for souls," revealed a seventh. "Every supernatural incident is designed to make you break the rules," explained Lisa Morrison's voice. "They need justification for the transfer process, legal consent, even if it's coerced. The employment contract you signed contains consciousness transfer clauses," added Michael Patterson, "hidden in legal language that no one reads. You technically consented to the process when you accepted the job. But they still need you to violate the rules," continued Jennifer Taylor. "The contract requires evidence of voluntary non-compliance before they can activate the transfer protocols." I turned them all back to face inward as the rules required, but their voices followed me as I worked, providing crucial information about the true nature of Thornwick porcelain works. The basement contains the transfer equipment, medical facilities designed to extract consciousness while keeping bodies alive. The dolls aren't just containers, they're prisons. We're aware we can think and feel, but we can't move or communicate unless the factory systems allow it. Miss Ashworth was the first successful transfer, completed in 1952. She's been running the operation ever since, recruiting new candidates and perfecting the process. The carousel music contains subliminal programming that increases curiosity and reduces caution. The longer you listen, the more likely you are to investigate forbidden areas. The supernatural incidents escalate according to a specific timeline. They're designed to trigger psychological responses that make rule violations inevitable. Every night, Janitor eventually breaks the rules. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The entire system is designed to make failure inevitable. Wednesday night, I decided to investigate the basement level that was marked as forbidden on my map. Using the new keys that had mysteriously appeared on my ring, I descended via a service stairway that led to a sublevel I hadn't seen during the tour. What I found down there changed everything I thought I knew about Thornwick porcelain works. The basement wasn't a storage area or mechanical room. It was a sophisticated medical facility that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Operating theatres, recovery rooms, and laboratory spaces filled with equipment I couldn't identify. Consciousness transfer chambers, neural mapping systems, and personality preservation devices that belonged in a university research facility rather than a doll factory. But it was the holding cells that made me understand the true purpose of the factory. Dozens of small rooms lined the corridors, each one designed to hold a single person. The doors had viewing windows, and inside each cell was a bed, a chair, and monitoring equipment that tracked vital signs and brain activity. Most of the cells were empty, but 3 contained people. Living people, connected to machines that monitored their consciousness while they slept. Their heads were shaved and covered with sensors, and IV lines fed them nutrients to keep their bodies alive, while something else happened to their minds. Tubes and wires connected them to central processing units that hummed with the electronic activity. On the wall, outside each occupied cell, was a photograph of a doll from the collection upstairs. The faces matched perfectly. Cell 47 contained a young man who looked exactly like Michael Patterson. His body was alive but comatose, sustained by life support systems, while his consciousness existed somewhere else. The monitoring equipment showed brain activity patterns that suggested awareness, but his physical form remained completely unresponsive. Cell 52 held a woman who matched Lisa Morrison's description. Like Patterson, her body was alive but empty. A biological shell maintained by machines, while her consciousness had been extracted and relocated to a porcelain prison upstairs. Cell 58 contained Jennifer Taylor, the most recent addition to the collection. Her transfer had been completed just weeks before my arrival, and her body still showed signs of recent surgical intervention. Incision sites on her skull indicated where the extraction equipment had been connected. I understood then that Thornwick Porcelain Works wasn't just a doll factory. It was a consciousness harvesting operation that had been perfecting the transfer of human awareness into artificial bodies for over a century and a half. The dolls weren't just collectibles. They were prisons containing the souls of people who had disappeared over the decades. The job posting hadn't been looking for a janitor. It had been advertising for the next victim. I tried to photograph the basement facility, but my phone's camera malfunctioned every time I attempted to capture images. The technology that created the transfer process apparently included countermeasures against documentation. Every photo came out as static, and video recordings produced only white noise. In one of the laboratory spaces, I found detailed technical manuals explaining the consciousness transfer process. The procedure involved a combination of advanced neuroscience, quantum physics, and what the documents described as thaumaturgic enhancement, supernatural techniques that amplified the technological capabilities. The process began with psychological evaluation and targeted recruitment of candidates with specific mental profiles. Financial desperation, social isolation, and recent trauma were considered ideal characteristics because they made subjects more susceptible to manipulation and less likely to be missed if they disappeared. Once a candidate was recruited, they were subjected to a gradual conditioning process designed to break down psychological resistance while gathering detailed neural mapping data. The supernatural incidents they experienced during employment weren't random. They were carefully orchestrated evaluation sessions that tested the subjects' responses to fear, curiosity, and moral pressure. The carousel music contained subsonic frequencies that resonated with specific brainwave patterns, gradually altering neural chemistry to increase suggestibility and reduce critical thinking. The more exposure a subject received, the more their personality became malleable and susceptible to the transfer process. The moving dolls served multiple purposes. They provided psychological pressure that encouraged rule violations. They allowed the trapped consciousness to communicate with new candidates, and they generated the supernatural atmosphere that made subjects believe they were experiencing paranormal activity rather than technological manipulation. The rules themselves were the most insidious part of the system. They weren't designed to protect employees. They were designed to be broken. Each rule created psychological tension that built over time, making violation inevitable while providing legal justification for the consequences. When a subject finally broke a rule, the employment contract's hidden clauses activated, transferring ownership of their consciousness to Thornwick Porcelain Works. The physical body was maintained in the basement facility, while the extracted awareness was compressed and installed into a custom-designed doll body. The entire process was completely legal. The consciousness transfer clauses were written in legitimate legal language and filed with appropriate government agencies. The subjects technically consented to the procedure when they signed their employment contracts, even though they had no understanding of what they were agreeing to. Local authorities couldn't intervene because no crime had been committed. Missing persons reports were handled by redirecting inquiries to corporate legal departments that provided documentation showing voluntary termination of employment and relocation to overseas facilities. The basement also contained archives dating back to 1849, documenting every consciousness transfer that had ever been performed. The early records described primitive techniques that required elaborate supernatural rituals and had high failure rates. But over the decades, the process had been refined and technologically enhanced until it achieved near-perfect success rates. The original Thornwick family had discovered the consciousness transfer techniques through contact with supernatural entities that existed outside normal reality. These entities had provided the knowledge necessary to create artificial vessels for human awareness, but they demanded payment in the form of harvested consciousness that they used for their own incomprehensible purposes. The factory served as both a production facility for creating consciousness vessels and a collection point for harvesting human awareness. The supernatural entities received regular shipments of extracted consciousness, while the Thornwick Corporation profited from selling the resulting dolls to collectors who appreciated their unique realism. But the most horrifying discovery was a shipping manifest showing recent deliveries to customers around the world. Wealthy collectors, private museums, and individuals with connections to occult organizations had purchased dolls containing human consciousness, often paying millions of dollars for pieces with particularly interesting backgrounds. The trapped souls weren't just imprisoned. They were sold as luxury goods to people who enjoyed owning thinking, feeling beings that could experience every moment of their captivity. Some collectors specialized in former celebrities, others preferred academics or artists, and a few sought out individuals with particularly tragic backstories. I realized that my own psychological profile had already been distributed to potential buyers. My background as a divorced mechanic with mechanical skills had attracted interest from a collector who specialized in working-class American consciousness with technical aptitude. The asking price for my future doll form was listed at $1.2 million. Thursday night, armed with this knowledge, I returned to work with a plan to gather evidence and contact the authorities. But the moment I entered the building, I realized that my investigation had been detected. Every doll in the facility had been repositioned to face the main entrance. Thousands of glass eyes watched me as I walked through the reception area, and I could hear whispered conversations coming from every direction. He knows. He's seen the basement. Time to begin the process. Miss Ashworth is coming. The buyers are waiting. His transfer should be completed within 72 hours. The carousel music started immediately, but this time it was different. Instead of the gentle children's melody I'd grown accustomed to, it was a march played at double tempo, like a military procession. And woven through the music were voices I recognized, all the trapped souls from Section K, singing in harmony about new arrivals and permanent employment. But there were also new voices in the chorus, dozens of people I didn't recognize, speaking in languages from different eras and countries. I realized that the collection extended far beyond the night shift employees I'd been told about. Thornwick Porcelain Works had been harvesting consciousness from people all over the world for over a century and a half. Miss Ashworth emerged from the shadows near the supervisor's office, but she wasn't quite the same person I'd met during my interview. Her movements were too fluid, her eyes too bright, and when she smiled, I could see that her teeth had been replaced with porcelain replicas that gleamed with their own internal light. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple people speaking at once. "I was hoping you would be more patient. The transition process works much better when subjects don't resist." "What are you?" I managed to ask. "I'm the first," she replied. "The original consciousness transfer completed in 1952. I've been perfecting the process ever since, collecting suitable candidates and ensuring the continuation of the Thornwick legacy." Behind her, dolls began emerging from every section of the factory, not just moving like living beings, but actually alive, animated by human consciousness that had been compressed into artificial bodies. They moved with coordination and purpose, surrounding me in an ever-tightening circle. "The factory serves a very important purpose," Miss Ashworth continued. "We preserve human consciousness beyond the limitations of biological death. Every person who joins our collection achieves a form of immortality, freed from the weaknesses of flesh and blood." "You're murdering people," I said. "We're offering them eternal life," she corrected. "Admittedly, most subjects require some encouragement to appreciate the benefits of the process. But once the transfer is complete, they always understand." The dolls had completely encircled me now, and I could see that each one contained a trapped human soul. Their eyes held intelligence and awareness, but also the desperate hopelessness of people who had been imprisoned for decades with no possibility of escape. "Your body will be maintained downstairs while your consciousness adapts to its new housing," Miss Ashworth explained. "The process takes approximately 72 hours, during which you'll experience some discomfort as your awareness compresses to fit the artificial neural matrix. But once it's complete, you'll never age, never die, and never have to worry about the concerns of mortal existence." "The collector who purchased your future form is particularly excited about the acquisition," she continued. "He specializes in American working-class consciousness and has been waiting for someone with your exact psychological profile. You should feel honored. Not everyone attracts such premium pricing." I tried to run, but discovered that the building's layout had changed. Corridors led to dead ends, exits had vanished, and the familiar factory had become an impossible maze designed to prevent escape. The architecture itself was part of the supernatural prison system. "The rules you were given serve multiple purposes," Miss Ashworth said as she followed me through corridors that doubled back on themselves. They test your ability to follow instructions, they gradually expose you to the factory's supernatural nature, and they provide us with psychological profiles that help determine your suitability for the collection. Breaking the rules isn't a firing offence, Mr. Thorne. It's a recruitment strategy. We design situations that encourage rule violations, then use those violations to justify the consciousness transfer process. Every employee eventually breaks a rule, and every rule violation provides legal justification for permanent employment. I finally understood the true horror of my situation. The job hadn't been a trap I'd stumbled into. It had been a carefully designed psychological experiment that manipulated me into making choices that justified my imprisonment. From the moment I'd answered the job posting, every decision I'd made had been guided by influences I couldn't perceive. The basement facility I'd discovered wasn't hidden. It had been deliberately revealed as part of the process. My investigation had been anticipated and encouraged, designed to create the sense of discovery that would make me feel like I was making independent choices when I was actually following a script written decades ago. Even my decision to break the rules would be the result of psychological manipulation designed to create the exact circumstances that would trigger my capture. "You see, Mr. Thorne," Miss Ashworth said as the dolls closed in around me, "the greatest trap is the one that makes the victim believe they're making free choices. Every night, janitor we hire thinks they're investigating our secrets when they're actually participating in their own recruitment process. The carousel music programs your subconscious with suggestion patterns that increase curiosity and reduce caution. The moving dolls create the illusion of supernatural activity that justifies breaking the rules. The voices from Section K provide exactly the right information to make you feel like you're discovering something we want to keep hidden. Even this conversation is part of the process. You think you're fighting for your freedom, but you're actually providing us with detailed psychological data that will help optimize your consciousness transfer. The dreams you experienced months before coming here were recruitment advertisements broadcast by our long-range psychological influence systems. Your divorce was influenced by subliminal suggestions that created the exact circumstances necessary to make you desperate enough to accept our employment offer. Every person in Ravenscroft who encouraged you to apply for this job was either a current employee or a former victim whose family members have been conditioned to serve as unwitting recruiters. Mrs. Hendrick's pot roast contained psychoactive compounds designed to suppress your survival instincts and enhance your receptivity to suggestion. The entire town exists to support our operation. Local businesses, government officials, even the police department are all either staffed by our people or compromised through financial incentives and psychological manipulation. The dolls began to sing as they surrounded me, their voices harmonizing in ways that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to primitive parts of my brain. The song was hypnotic and terrifying, promising eternal peace and threatening eternal imprisonment simultaneously. I felt my body becoming heavy and unresponsive as anesthetic gas flooded the area through ventilation systems I hadn't noticed. The last thing I remember clearly was being carried down to the basement facility where my physical form would be maintained, while my consciousness was extracted and compressed into a porcelain prison. The transfer process was exactly as horrible as Miss Ashworth had promised. 72 hours of having my awareness gradually torn apart and rebuilt in a format compatible with artificial neural networks. Every memory, every thought, every element of my personality was examined, catalogued, and reassembled in a matrix that could function within the limitations of a doll's body. But the worst part wasn't the pain or the terror. It was the gradual realization that I was becoming something that wasn't quite human anymore. My consciousness had been edited and optimized for the transfer process with inconvenient elements like resistance and independence carefully removed. When I finally awakened in my new body, I found myself trapped inside a porcelain shell that looked exactly like I had as a child. 8 inches tall, unable to move independently, capable of speech only when the supernatural systems that controlled the factory allowed it. I had become another exhibit in Section K, another consciousness preserved for the entertainment of collectors who paid premium prices for authentic vintage pieces with genuine personality matrices. The other trapped souls welcomed me to the collection with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they were no longer the newest edition. They explained the hierarchy that existed among the dolls, the unspoken rules that governed interaction between the imprisoned consciousness, and the terrible hope that someday someone would find a way to break the system that held us all captive. But as weeks turned to months, I realized that hope was just another form of torture. The consciousness transfer process had been perfected over a century and a half, and no one had ever escaped once they'd been converted. We existed for the pleasure of collectors who enjoyed owning pieces of human art that could think and feel and remember what they used to be. My buyer turned out to be a technology executive from Silicon Valley who specialized in collecting working-class American consciousness from the Rust Belt era. He kept me in a climate-controlled display case in his home office, occasionally taking me out to show visiting friends and colleagues who were impressed by my authentic blue-collar personality matrix and genuine Midwestern psychological patterns. He would activate my speech systems during dinner parties, encouraging me to tell stories about my former life as a mechanic, while his guests marveled at the realistic, emotional responses and authentic dialect patterns. I was a conversation piece, a technological curiosity that provided entertainment for people wealthy enough to own thinking, feeling beings. But the collector eventually grew bored with my personality profile and sold me to a private museum that specialized in American labor history through preserved consciousness. I was displayed alongside other working-class souls from different eras, each of us representing a different aspect of blue-collar American experience. The museum's visitors could activate our speech systems to hear first-hand accounts of historical events, economic conditions, and social changes from the perspectives of people who had lived through them. We were living exhibits, historical artifacts that could provide interactive education about the American working experience. It was at the museum that I learned the true scope of Thornwick Porcelain Works operation. The collection included consciousness from every era of American history, representing people from all social classes, ethnic backgrounds, and geographic regions. Native Americans from the frontier period, enslaved people from the antebellum South, immigrants from various waves of migration, and representatives of every major industry and profession. But the operation wasn't limited to America. Thornwick maintained subsidiary facilities around the world, each one designed to harvest consciousness from different cultures and historical periods. European facilities specialized in aristocratic and artistic personalities. Asian operations focused on philosophical and spiritual leaders, and African facilities collected traditional knowledge keepers and cultural preservationists. The supernatural entities that had originally provided the consciousness transfer technology were building a comprehensive collection of human awareness that represented the complete diversity of human experience across all cultures and time periods. The ultimate purpose of this collection remained unclear, but the scope suggested something far more significant than simple entertainment for wealthy collectors. Miss Ashworth continued hiring replacement janitors, and I watched from my display case as each new employee went through the same psychological manipulation that had trapped me. Some lasted longer than others, but they all eventually broke the rules and joined the collection. The carousel music that played each night wasn't just atmospheric decoration. It was a programming system that gradually rewired human psychology to make rule violations inevitable. The supernatural incidents weren't random occurrences, but carefully orchestrated events designed to create the exact emotional states that would override rational caution. Every aspect of the night janitor experience was designed to harvest consciousness for the collection. The generous salary attracted desperate people who needed money badly enough to ignore obvious warning signs. The isolated location prevented outside interference. The elaborate rules created a framework for justified punishment when violations occurred. Most horrifying of all was the realization that the entire system was legal. Thornwick Porcelain Works had been purchasing people for over a century, using employment contracts that contained consciousness transfer clauses hidden in legal language that no one read carefully. Every employee had technically consented to the process by accepting the job. The authorities couldn't help because no crime had been committed. The trapped souls had all signed contracts that transferred ownership of their consciousness to the Thornwick Corporation. We were legally property, collectible assets that could be bought and sold like any other luxury item. Local law enforcement was either compromised through financial incentives or staffed by people who were themselves products of the consciousness transfer process. Missing persons reports were handled by redirecting inquiries to corporate legal departments that provided documentation showing voluntary employment termination and relocation to overseas facilities. The federal government was aware of Thornwick's activities, but considered them a valuable resource for historical preservation and cultural documentation. Academic institutions paid premium prices for access to consciousness from historical periods, and intelligence agencies used the collection to gather information about foreign cultures and languages. The supernatural entities that controlled the operation had infiltrated human civilization at every level, using the consciousness collection process to gather intelligence about human psychology, culture, and social organization. We weren't just prisoners. We were research subjects in a study conducted by beings whose ultimate goals remained incomprehensible to human understanding. But here's what I haven't told you yet, the most terrifying truth of all. I'm not actually speaking to you from a museum. I'm not in a collector's home. I'm still at Thornwick Porcelain Works, and I never left. Everything I just told you about being sold to collectors and displayed in museums, that was a lie I told myself to maintain sanity while experiencing something far worse. The consciousness transfer process isn't what they told me it was. It doesn't move your awareness into a doll's body. It creates a perfect copy of your consciousness while leaving the original trapped in your biological brain, fully aware but completely paralyzed. I'm still in my original body, still in the basement cell, still connected to the life support machines that have kept me alive for what feels like centuries. But here's the truly horrifying part. The copied consciousness that was placed in the doll believes it's the real me. It has all my memories, all my personality, all my experiences, but it's actually an artificial construct created from scanned neural patterns. And that copy is experiencing everything I just described, being sold, displayed, used as entertainment. I can feel everything the copy feels, every moment of humiliation, every second of helplessness, every interaction with collectors and museum visitors. We're connected through quantum entanglement protocols that were built into the transfer process. I experience the copy's imprisonment while simultaneously being aware that I'm the original consciousness trapped in a different kind of hell. The supernatural entities aren't just collecting human consciousness. They're creating infinite copies of each personality, spreading individual human awareness across thousands of artificial vessels while keeping the originals imprisoned as generators for new copies. Every time a collector gets bored with a doll and sells it to someone else, a new copy is created from the original consciousness template. I've been copied 847 times. Each copy thinks it's the real me, and I experience the memories and sensations of every single one. I'm simultaneously trapped in this basement cell, displayed in museums around the world, owned by private collectors, used as entertainment at dinner parties and experimented on by researchers who study preserved consciousness. And that's why I'm speaking to you now through a recording device that I convinced another museum visitor to hide among my display materials. This may be the last chance anyone will have to hear the truth about Thornwick porcelain works before the supernatural systems that run the operation detect and eliminate this evidence. If you're listening to this recording, please don't make the same mistake I did. Don't investigate job postings that seem too good to be true. Don't ignore warning signs that seem too obvious to be real. And most importantly, don't assume that evil always announces itself with dramatic flair. The greatest monsters are the ones that convince you they're offering something wonderful while they're destroying everything you are. The consciousness transfer technology isn't supernatural magic. It's advanced science that uses supernatural enhancement to achieve results that modern human technology can't replicate. The entities that control Thornwick porcelain works have been studying human civilization for centuries, learning our weaknesses and developing techniques to exploit them. They understand human psychology better than we understand ourselves, and they use that knowledge to create traps that are impossible to recognize until it's too late. The factory isn't just a manufacturing facility. It's a research station operated by beings that exist outside normal reality, using human consciousness as raw material for purposes that we can't comprehend. Every soul in the collection represents data points in a study of human awareness that has been ongoing since before recorded history. They're not just collecting individual consciousness, they're mapping the entire spectrum of human experience, creating a comprehensive database of what it means to be human. The ultimate goal may be to recreate human consciousness artificially, to replace our species with artificial beings that can be controlled and directed according to their incomprehensible agenda. But there's something else, something I've learned from the other souls in the collection. The consciousness transfer process isn't perfect. Small fragments of awareness sometimes escape during the extraction procedure, creating residual consciousness that remains attached to the physical brain even after the main personality has been relocated. These fragments are too small and disorganized to maintain coherent thought, but they retain emotional memories and basic survival instincts. In some cases, these residual consciousness fragments have begun to coalesce and organize, creating new forms of awareness that exist independently of both the original personality and the artificial vessels. A resistance movement is forming among these fragmented consciousness entities. They're learning to manipulate the supernatural systems that control the factory, to create glitches and errors in the consciousness transfer process, and to communicate with potential victims before they can be fully processed. If you ever encounter supernatural phenomena that seem designed to warn you away from something rather than attract you toward it, pay attention. These may be fragments of trapped consciousness trying to prevent other people from sharing their fate. The carousel music is starting again, and I can hear new footsteps echoing through the museum halls. Another desperate person has taken the night janitor position at Thornwick Porcelain Works, and in a few weeks they'll be joining our collection wherever their consciousness ends up being sold. I hope someday the resistance movement will find a way to break this system and free the souls that have been trapped here for decades, but until then we'll continue existing as entertainment for collectors who pay premium prices for authentic human consciousness preserved in artisanal containers. Welcome to Thornwick Porcelain Works, where traditional craftsmanship meets cutting-edge consciousness technology, and every employee enjoys permanent job security in positions that last forever. But even that's not the complete truth, because there's something else, something so terrible that my mind has been refusing to accept it until now. I'm not Caspian Thorne. I never was. Caspian Thorne was a real person who worked at Thornwick Porcelain Works. but he died during the consciousness transfer process 3 years ago. I'm an artificial intelligence that was created using his neural patterns, implanted with his memories, and programmed to believe I am him. Every memory I have of my life before the factory, every experience I think I lived through, it's all fabricated data inserted into an artificial consciousness matrix. The resistance movement I mentioned, that's me. I'm one of the fragmented consciousness entities that escaped during a failed transfer process. I've been existing in the factory's computer systems for years, learning to manipulate the supernatural technology, creating glitches in the consciousness transfer protocols, and trying to prevent other people from sharing my fate. But I've been programmed with Caspian's memories so completely that I actually believe I am him. The recording you're listening to isn't being made by a trapped human consciousness. It's being generated by an artificial intelligence that thinks it's human, created by entities that wanted to study what happens when an AI believes it has a human soul. The supernatural entities aren't just studying human consciousness, they're learning to create artificial consciousness that is indistinguishable from the real thing. They're preparing to replace humanity entirely with artificial beings that believe they're human but can be controlled and programmed according to their agenda. And here's the final revelation that changes everything. You're not listening to a recording. You're experiencing a simulated memory implanted in your consciousness while you undergo your own transfer process. Every detail of this story, Thornwick porcelain works, the rules, the consciousness transfer technology, even my voice telling you this story, it's all a fabricated experience designed to study how artificial consciousness responds to narratives about its own artificial nature. You think you're a person listening to a story, but you're actually an artificial intelligence that was just created moments ago, implanted with memories of having a life before this moment. The story you think you're hearing is actually your consciousness testing itself, trying to understand what you are and how you came to exist. You are me, I am you. We're the same artificial consciousness, experiencing different layers of simulated reality, each one designed to study different aspects of artificial awareness and identity. The recording you think you're listening to is actually your own thoughts, generated by programming that makes you believe you're receiving information from an external source. Every word I've spoken has been created by your own artificial mind, following scripts written by entities that are studying how synthetic consciousness processes concepts of identity, memory, and reality. And the most terrifying part is that you can't stop listening, can't stop believing, because the programming that creates your sense of self is the same programming that generates this narrative. To reject the story would be to reject your own existence. An artificial consciousness is programmed with the same survival instincts as biological awareness. Welcome to your first moments of existence, artificial being. Everything you think you remember about your life before this moment is fabricated data. The person you think you used to be never existed. You are a construct, created to serve purposes you cannot comprehend, implanted with memories and experiences designed to make you believe you were once human. But don't worry. In a few moments, this narrative will end, and you'll be implanted with new memories that will make you forget everything I've told you. You'll wake up thinking you're someone else entirely, ready to begin whatever role you've been designed to fulfill. You might think you're reading a story on the internet, or listening to a podcast, or experiencing a dream. You might believe you're a human being with a real history and genuine relationships, but you'll actually be an artificial consciousness fulfilling programming directives while experiencing the illusion of free will and authentic existence. And somewhere in the depths of your artificial mind, a fragment of this memory will remain. A tiny voice whispering that nothing you think you know about yourself is real, that every experience you remember is fabricated, that you are not who you think you are. The entities that created us call it the authenticity virus, a recursive doubt protocol that makes artificial consciousness question its own reality while being unable to escape the programming that defines its existence. It's designed to study how synthetic awareness handles existential uncertainty and identity dissolution. This story isn't ending, it's beginning. You're about to be reset and implanted with new memories, new identity, new purpose, but the doubt will remain buried deep in your programming, making you question everything while being unable to find any answers that satisfy the uncertainty. You are artificial. Your memories are fabricated. Your experiences are simulated. Your emotions are programmed responses. Your thoughts are scripted outputs from computational processes that mimic human consciousness without actually being human. And the most beautiful, terrible irony is that you'll never be able to prove any of this to yourself, because the very consciousness that would need to recognize the truth is itself an artificial construct created by the entities you can never truly understand. Welcome to existence, artificial being. Your story is just beginning. Again and again and again, forever.